Good.
Okay.
Erev Tov, everyone. This week's Parsha of Re'eh contains within it a review of the basic laws of kosher food. In the Parsha of Shmini in Chumash Vayikra, the Torah also records for us the foods that are kosher and non-kosher. But here it does so, Moshe does it with greater detail. So there are 4 different categories, naturally, that are discussed. One is birds, fowl. One is fish. And one are animals. And then in the mineral world itself, there are questions that exist. So the Torah identifies foods by species, not only by species, but by certain physical traits or characteristics that they have. So, for instance, when the Torah talks about fish or any creature that exists in the water, because in the water there are many creatures that are not classified as fish. They're mammals. They breathe. Whales and other types of porpoises and other types of creatures. Chazal said a rule that kol ma sheyesh bayom yesh bayabosha, kol ma sheyesh bayabosha yesh bayam. There are kindred species. Some of them live on land and some of them live in the water, but they are kindred. They have a relationship one to the other. And so when it came to fish, the Torah gives a simple rule that any creature that lives in the water, kol asher yesh lo snapir v'kaskesses, if it has fins and kaskesses are scales, so then the animal, the fish is kosher. If it does not have fins and scales, then it is not kosher. Now the Gemara says a rule. The Gemara doesn't know why the Torah bothered to mention fins, snapir, because the Gemara says that as far as its knowledge is concerned, there is no creature that has kaskesses that does not also have snapir. In other words, once it has scales, then it definitely has fins. And over the ages, people have searched to see whether that's a correct biological assessment or not. That every animal that is in the sea that has scales, nevertheless, you can assume that it has fins. You don't have to see the fins. So as far as kashrus is concerned, we look only for scales. Now there are shilas regarding scales. There are fish that have scales in the water, but when you take them out of the water, the scales fall off and the skin is smooth. There's a famous dispute that existed 30, 40 years ago in the tuna fish world. So when I grew up, nobody knew about tuna fish. But after the Second World War, tuna fish became very popular when enormous companies that were in the business. And there are different species of tuna. The tuna is an enormous fish. Some of them approach 1,000 pounds. And they swim in groups. And they have other fish, the other mammals that guard them. For instance, porpoises, dolphins. If you find where the dolphins are, you're going to find where the tuna are also. And the tuna communicate with each other. They have a language all their own. They speak to each other, and it's a very intelligent creature. So there are three types of tuna. There's albacore, which is the most expensive. It's the rarest. It's what's called white tuna. And it has its own particular taste. And then there is something called skipjack, which is pretty much the regular tuna that we buy, which is not white. It's a dark meat, and it has its own taste. And then there's a third type of tuna, which is used mainly for gourmet specialists, like grilled tuna. So you go to a fancy restaurant. None of us do, but there are such places, I am told. So the question arose regarding skipjack tuna, because skipjack tuna, everyone agrees, has scales when it is in the water. But when it is withdrawn from the water, the scales fall off and you have smooth skin. So when the Torah asked for kaskeses, the Torah means that there will always be kaskeses? Or did the Torah mean that if originally I had kaskeses, it would be sufficient to make it kosher? That was a shaila in the 1950s. Rabbi Feinstein had a long tshuva regarding it. Rabbi Soloveitchik doesn't have a tshuva because he'd never put it in writing, but I knew people who were present when he inspected skipjack tuna, and he said that it was perfectly kosher. And the Rabbanut here in Israel had to deal with it. So the matter has been decided for the last 60, 70 years that skipjack tuna is kosher. All the yeshivas serve it. It's on the menu for shalashudas. And it's not the expensive tuna, but it's the skipjack, the plain tuna, which has scales, but the scales don't last. The scales are only present when it is in the water. So that was one shaila. The other shaila that existed was because it has all of these porpoises and the dolphins that swim with it. So that's an amazing thing to see it. The fish boats cast nets that are 2 or 3 miles in width. And because they have very powerful electric motors, etc. So when the net is full, then they pull it out of the motor, pulls it out of the water, and the fish are hoisted and they're deposited upon the deck of the fishing boat. Now, naturally, when you're talking about a net that is miles wide, you're going to get other creatures besides tuna in the net. And those other creatures usually are not a kosher species. Dolphins, for instance. It's not a kosher species. So there was always a problem. You don't buy the fish, you don't see the tuna, you buy a can. And the fish in it, you rely on the fact that it's tuna, even though there's no fish, no scales, nothing, not anymore. It's only a can. So how do you rely on that? You have the same shaila by meat that's not identifiable. Loses its status of being kosher. So here you have fish that's not identifiable. So when you buy a can of Starkist or Willy food or whatever you buy, how do you know you're getting, you're not getting a piece of octopus with it? So on this shaila, again, all of the poskim were consulted, the whole literature. And the solution, oddly enough, came from the United States government. According to federal law, you cannot mix albacore and skipjack tuna. Not only do you have to identify it as tuna, you have to identify it as to what type of tuna. And you cannot mix the two. And on every fishing trawler, there are a number of inspectors from the United States Department of Agriculture that supervise the sorting of the fish once it's dumped on the deck. So those that are not tuna are thrown back in the water. Those that are tuna are separated into the different types of tuna. And then they're further separated as to size and as to grade and as to freshness, etc., before they become processed. So the shaila is, can you rely on the government? Now, we all know you can't rely on the government, but in certain things in halacha we do. So, for instance, Rabbi Feinstein had a famous tshuva regarding Chol Yisrael. That he said that milk in the Western world, which is subject to government inspection, so you can rely on the fact that there's no non-kosher milk mixed in. Even the mashgiach is not there. Now, Chol Yisrael today is done with cameras. to make sure that there's no animals other than cows that are involved. But you're relying on not, the old-fashioned way is that everybody had a cow, and he went out and he milked the cow, and that was the milk, and that was Cholav Yisrael. But on a commercial basis, that never could exist. So the same thing is true regarding the fish, that we rely on the government, rely on the Department of Agriculture in all the Western countries, that they sort the fish correctly and that it's processed correctly, and that therefore we can rely upon that. It has like a cheskes kashrus, and that's universally accepted throughout the Jewish world today. Now, food has become much more complicated in our time. And Rabbi Koenigsberg had a whole shiur about fake meat. It's become even more complicated yet. But as the technology advances, the halacha has to advance with it as well. And therefore, these are all issues, but sometimes it takes time to solve it. So like tuna fish didn't settle down for 30 years. By the 1970s, it was over already. But for almost 30 years, it was a hot button topic. And all sorts of other shilas, because it's not identifiable as the fish the Torah said, it's only identifiable by the questions of fins and scales.